I'm so happy that you have chosen to come tonight for this important conversation. Some of you are here tonight, I'm looking around the room, because you are taking my class about coming together across divides and reducing polarization, and you had no other option. But many of you are here because you want to debrief last week's election with Rick Klein to better understand the results. I want to name that some of us in this room feel disappointed, confused, and afraid right now. And others of us might feel relieved, happy, and hopeful for the future. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here. We come together as one community to meet each other with open hearts, open minds, and curiosity. So before I introduce Rick, I want to share a poem by Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. So I invite you to think about that as we hear ideas tonight, as Rick answers questions. And so let's introduce Rick, in case you don't know him. Rick Klein is, I cut your bio down a little bit to spare you, because I know how that feels. Rick Klein is the Vice President and Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for ABC News. He oversees bureau operations and manages all news teams based in Washington for breaking news, daily coverage, and special events. Rick has interviewed a wide range of key political figures, including President Joe Biden, former and incoming President Donald Trump, Senator Mitt Romney, former House Speaker Paul Ryan, the late Senators John McCain and Ted Kennedy, as well as Ken Burns, Tom Hanks, Bradley Cooper, and NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a broad range of other prominent individuals. Just a diverse, eclectic group. He has helped plan and produce more than 20 debates, including the most recent debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump. Rick has covered voting results on interactive maps during network coverage of primaries and general elections. You may have seen him on ABC News this past Tuesday night into early Wednesday morning, where he rolled straight into going onto The View with no sleep. Needless to say, Rick had a very busy week, and we are so fortunate that you are here tonight. So thank you.
On there?
And we won't keep you here until 5 in the morning, unless you really want to do that again.
There are some people that are not here by choice either, including my kids. So Thanks you guys to them, and my wife, Lainey's over there. So
they were encouraging me to ask really hard questions to really get them tonight. So over the past week, you have been on a range of ABC programs, as we said, The View, Good Morning America, and others. Fortunately for us, we get to hear your expert analysis live right here in our synagogue, which is also your congregation. You had how long was the bar mitzvah? 3 weeks ago?
Like a month ago.
A month ago.
Yeah. The second of the two, both of Washington Hebrew. So
it seems only right to ask you some questions about your upbringing, and particularly your Jewish upbringing. So I'm curious, what influence, if any, did Judaism have on your career path?
Thank you for that. And it really is an honor to be here. I'm thrilled to be here after this tumultuous week. It's kind of a moment of calm, of zen for me to be able to speak to a crowd like this. And I appreciate you all having interest in this. You know, I grew up in a pretty secular Jewish household. I went to Hebrew school, grew up in Long Island, where, you know, Jewish identity wasn't really something that I thought much about because I knew so many other Jewish kids. I wasn't aware of a Jewish identity first and foremost. I was aware of the fact that I grew up with all these other kids. And I do remember that I actually studied a lot for my bar mitzvah and took it very seriously. And I took Hebrew school very seriously. And if this is a Jewish influence or not, I remember that we had to do a project one time that involved telling the story of Moses and the tablets, kind of a basic thing. And I decided to do mine in the style of the NBC Nightly News. And I actually arranged to have the music play, and then I gave the report. And it was kind of the first, I don't know why I did it that way, but it just occurred to me, and I actually have thought this memory for a long time, but it was kind of the first time that I kind of envisioned myself as a broadcaster. But I would say what I've always identified with is I grew up in a family of teachers. Both my parents were teachers. My brother's now a teacher. And I think what I do now in journalism, in explanatory journalism, a lot of it is teaching. And I think that is part of the Jewish tradition and something that I've always identified with closely. My mom has said that to me often, that when she watches me, she feels like you're teaching. And it's kind of an outgrowth of that. So I think that, to me, is a big piece of the identity that I grew up with.
Would you get in trouble, since you work for ABC, if we had the NBC Nightly News play for you?
It's okay. I think the statute of limitations has passed on that. It's okay.
So, on the same theme, do Jewish values impact your work today? Or how does your Judaism come into play in what you do?
Sure. I mean, I think everyone brings their own identity and their upbringing and their values to what they do in journalism. In an ideal world, we put that aside in the interest of storytelling, in the interest of telling a story objectively and being fair and doing what you can. But really, it's the diverse range of views that go into a newsroom, that go into a discussion, to any boardroom in America or in a classroom in America, that I think make it what it is. So it influences me in the sense of this is who I am, and I'm not going to change that when I do the job. I don't think it influences my news judgment or my delivery. I'm very public about who I am. You can read my bio and find out more about me, as the rabbi did tonight. But it's important, just as it would be for a Muslim reporter or a Christian reporter. I mean, there's things that influence you and your religion in direct ways, but it's important when you're telling the stories, when you're putting this out there, realizing that actually that's not what most of my viewers or my readers are thinking about. That's not the same prism that they're bringing to it. And I think that's, most reporters do that just kind of as like a second nature. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly my goal, is that, if you're watching or reading something I wrote or watching something that I'm doing, you can know something about me, but you won't necessarily know where I stand on religious issues or issues that affect a religion. And I mentioned my mom earlier. I don't even tell her who I vote for. She asks. So do my kids. But I feel like that's an important part of what I do, is to keep personal views private.
My Jewish values come into my work a lot. You'll be surprised.
Wow. When do I get to turn the tables here?
Okay, so we're going to move into some more. Just so you kind of understand the outline of what we're going to do tonight. And the only thing I haven't quite figured out is your index cards, but I'll come up with a plan while we're sitting here. But I'm going to ask some more general questions about the election, and then move into some questions that are more specific to what we might be thinking about as Jews. And at some point in there, Rich, who's in the back, will come around and collect your note cards, and I will take a look at them. And also, I may check my watch from time to time, and it's not because Rick is boring. It's because I'm trying to leave time for all of you. Okay, so let's dive in. Some say that this election represents a political realignment, and that former President Trump's overwhelming victory shows that this country has completely shifted and changed. From your vantage point of having covered numerous presidential and congressional campaigns, do you agree? Why or why not?
I don't think that there's really any such thing as a permanent realignment in American politics. I think, the first campaign that I covered pretty closely was 2004, and Karl Rove talked about a permanent Republican majority after that campaign. By 2006, the Republicans lost the House and the Senate, and 2008, of course, Obama happens. And in 2009, James Carville wrote a book called 40 More Years, about how the Democrats were going to be dominant for the next 4 decades because of all these demographic things that were happening. And of course, 7 years later, Donald Trump gets elected. I think the last couple of decades have been almost constant change in society. Obviously, the technological changes, the health changes, COVID, all of these disruptions have happened, and the political disruptions have happened kind of on a regular sequence as well. I think there's only one election in the last 20 years where either the House or Senate or the presidency or all three of those things haven't flipped. So that's become kind of the normal in politics, that you're going to have this churn. So Donald Trump, no doubt, knitted together a lot of coalitions that previously had been Democratic. But if you look to what other candidates were doing at the exact same time, in 5 of the 7 battleground states, there were also Senate candidates, Democrats running. And in 4 of those 5 cases, and maybe even the 5th, depending on where it lands in Pennsylvania, the Democratic candidate actually won, outperformed Kamala Harris. And so Trump clearly brought something new, but it wasn't necessarily transferable to other candidates. And I think for a permanent realignment, you need to see that. And I think political parties have a grand way of kind of moving enough to try to capture a majority next time. The Democratic Party that's perceived today in 2024 will be different in 2028 because other things will happen in the ensuing years and the party will move. So I didn't see anything in last Tuesday that said to me, this is now what the new alignment of American politics is. There's no doubt that Donald Trump took a lot of voters who used to live here and moved them to there. And you saw that across the board in all kinds of communities, but I don't think there's any such thing as permanence.
Thanks. So thanks for giving me a nice segue into the next question, which is that we saw in this election something we already knew, that this is a very divided country. And we've seen this high-level exit poll data and a shift. And particularly, I've read a lot of articles about the Latino shift. But can you identify anything beyond the headlines that's particularly telling or surprising about these shifts? Yeah,
I mean, the shift among Latino voters is real, and just about across income levels and demographic groups. But I think that inside of this, and there's been a lot written about black male voters in particular. The fact that Democrats used to lose upper income earners and win lower income earners, and now the reverse is true, is to me a really interesting fact. A lot has been talked about how Democrats lost touch with the working class. That certainly Bernie Sanders has been public in saying he thinks that's what the Democrats' problem was in losing this election. Donald Trump has been able to reach out to a kind of voter that traditionally had voted Democratic or didn't vote at all, and his message resonated with voters again across the board in almost every state, in almost every type of community that traditionally had been Democratic. Someone made the observation that if you drove past any union hall in America as recently as 2004, 2008. You could guess that is a pretty Democratic stronghold. And in 2024, that's more likely to have a MAGA flag than a vote Democratic flag. And that's a pretty profound shift. Now, I don't think, like I said, I'm not convinced that it's a permanent shift. And I think you can see that if you look at an old electoral map, go back to 1992 and see how Bill Clinton won, or even more recently, look at the counties, and you can see how a kind of sea of red spreading out, and the blue dots getting darker blue, the red dots getting brighter, and a whole lot of formerly light blue places turning purple or red. And that's primarily, it's economic, yes, it's also cultural. It's about identifying how people live their lives and what party connects with them. And Donald Trump, I think, sustained last week that he's got a connection there, that at least for this one night in this one election, that Vice President Harris and the Democrats didn't have.
So, I think to continue this, this question line. Some say that Kamala Harris lost because America is simply not ready for a woman or a Black or South Asian woman to be president. And as you just mentioned, others are saying that Donald Trump was able to pull in people that maybe the public didn't expect him to pull in. So it sounds, you're talking about one of these kind of economic explanations. Do you think that's the best explanation? Do you think there are other explanations? Do you think that the woman explanation has any clout here?
So a really smart 15-year-old sitting right over there who might be related to me asked earlier that his tough question for me would be, did Donald Trump win or did Kamala Harris lose? And I'm glad he prepped me with that question. And his really smart brother, 2 seats over, like nodded and he wants to know the same answer, I can tell. And this may sound like a cop-out, but both things can be true. And I think in modern elections, they're fought so much at the margins that you can find almost any explanation and call it the big explanation. You know, you could look at this and say that this was inevitable because of the post-COVID recovery and the inflation that was drawn by it, and the fact that Joe Biden stayed in the race until June, when, you know, after his very poor debate performance, and, you know, didn't give Harris a chance to define herself. That can be your explanation. Your explanation could be that, you know, Trump is just this kind of unicorn who's able to do these things that no one else does and defies political gravity, and he was only made stronger by this whole process. Yeah, you could definitely fashion a very compelling economic argument or a cultural argument. You know, I think about campaigns in terms of strategies and tactics, and the strategies are like the big things that you do, these, you know, big shifts in messaging, and then the tactics are where you spend your money, what you know, who you choose as your running mate. You know, those are the more the tactical things, and I'm convinced that there's not a tactical thing or three that Kamala Harris could have done that would have changed the election. I think if she had only lost Pennsylvania and won the other big battlegrounds, then you could have said Josh Shapiro should have been on the ticket, and that would have, you know, you can make a compelling case there. You know, a lot of people talked back about Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016 and said she never even campaigned in Wisconsin. It's true, she did campaign in Pennsylvania a lot and lost. So you know, I don't know that would have worked there either. So I think that I don't see a like, if only they had done X, Y, and Z type of thing. But in terms of the strategy of presenting your candidacy to the country, I think that Donald Trump had a better read on what people wanted at this moment, and you know, whether it's good for them, bad for them is another question. Whether people knew exactly what the policies are going to be is another question entirely. But that's what people vote on, and that's where it landed.
So shifting gears a little bit to the debate, which I know that you were behind the scenes on. After that debate, the media said, or at least the media I saw, said that Kamala Harris won with flying colors. And given that you've been involved in many presidential debates and with perhaps a little 20/20 hindsight, do you think the media missed something or got it wrong? Yeah,
it's interesting because a lot of the media that I consumed after the debate were things saying bad, you know, people saying bad things about us or Kamala Harris, and that was out there. And it probably wouldn't have been front and center for all the people in this room, but that there was another story being told out of that, you know, specific to the debate, yes, but even more broadly over the course of the entire campaign, you know. And I try to consume a lot of content that isn't mainstream media, so to speak, and, you know, have lots of TVs on in my office and try to, you know, have things cross my Twitter feed and my desk that shows a diverse range of viewpoints, which I encourage everyone to do, by the way. I think conservatives should read liberal stuff and liberals should read conservative stuff and watch the other side a little bit. I encourage anyone to have a media diet like that. You know, and I don't know that. I mean, you know, the debate was one thing. We felt very proud of the way we conducted ourselves. I was very proud of ABC News in conducting every aspect of that debate, start to finish. But it was another example of almost anything that happens that, you know, people will perceive what they want out of it, and by the time it gets, you know, chewed through a news cycle or two, you know, it gets perceived differently. I think, our debate, I think 70 million people watched it, which is an astounding number in 2024 or in any news environment. And I have no doubt that it had some impact on people. The intention for our perspective is not to have at the end of it a winner or a loser. Mm-hmm. People make their own judgments about that. It's to put some light, provide some light, some way for people to understand the candidates a little bit differently. And so it's not about an outcome. It's about the process and about how people perceive it, which is, of course, their right.
Thanks. So Trump has laid out a number of priorities for day one of his presidency, some of which include launching a deportation program, rolling back Biden administration energy and climate measures, ending the war between Russia and Ukraine, and more. Do you expect that the second Trump administration will hit the ground running with expertise and capability to execute on this vision, or do you think we're going to see a team that needs to get its sea legs?
So I think they are better positioned than they were the first time to do more things that they say that they want to do for a number of reasons. One is they have an empowered they're empowered with a better vote margin in the Senate. More members of the House and the Senate both owe their political existences or identities to Donald Trump. A lot of the kind of institutionalist establishment Republicans that were in Congress before are gone. Mitt Romney won't be in the new Congress. Liz Cheney, obviously, long departed the Congress. John McCain. Second is the Supreme Court, which is, with a conservative 6-3 majority, has opened the door for a lot more executive authority, a lot more executive action. I also think Trump doesn't have to worry about re-election. That was something that was hanging over their minds for much of the first term, was how is this perceived by voters, and they really don't have to worry about that anymore. And the last, and I think you were getting at this, the last and I think maybe most important part is that the people around him are more loyal to him directly and have learned from experience how to get things done. And the first year, the whole 4 years of the Trump presidency were kind of chaotic, but the first year in particular, involved a lot of hirings and firings and, false starts on Capitol Hill and missed votes, and, it was an unsteady kind of back and forth. They tightened their ship quite a bit by year 2 and got a big tax bill and some other legislation moving, and I think they're going to start, as much as they can, hitting the ground running. They've got a lot of things organized already, executive orders for day one, legislation. It doesn't mean that it will be a finely tuned machine. It's going to be wild and chaotic at times, there's no doubt. There's going to be, if past this prologue at all, there'll be lots of staff turnover, and there'll be fights on Capitol Hill because the margins are very tight. But I think for a range of reasons, the second turn of the Trump presidency is going to be more, I would presume it to be more effective in terms of quick action, just because they've learned a lot of lessons and they have a much more favorable environment.
So I'm particularly interested in polarization because of my own background, because of my experience being in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally in 2017. And I'm wondering if you think understanding election results and voter demographics can help us to bridge divides.
I actually think yes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, polarization is, the perceptions of polarization are not helped by the fact that I color in a map red or blue, or that voters choose one or the other, right? It is essentially a binary choice. It's a two-party system, so almost the definition of polarization. You're going to end up with a divide. But I think that the way that things shift kind of together and the way that they shifted last week actually gives me some hope for, if not quite healing, at least understanding. I think there was a clarity of message last week. I think if the 7 battleground states had gone in different directions, if we were within 10,000 votes and had legal fights in other places, we'd be talking. I might not be here today because I'd be working, and that would have been kind of a more uncertain outcome that would accentuate the polarization. This is not the result that almost half the country wanted. It was the result that just slightly more than half the country did want. And those same people that voted red this time might vote blue next time. And many of them, if not most or all of them, wouldn't say they endorse every single thing that Donald Trump has said, and I'm sure most of Harris supporters wouldn't say the same thing either. And it's trite to say this, that there's more that unites us than divides us. I think, if you believe the economic explanation, for instance, people voted because they were uncertain and things were expensive and they were anxious and they've seen a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty and wanted once again to try something different and were rebelling against the current administration. That's a trend happening across the world, by the way, and it's happened in this country a lot in the last couple of decades. And that to me is a decisive enough message that everyone can learn from. And the answer is not change your political beliefs to conform or to understand that the country has moved on, but it's to try to reclaim it. And that's what Democrats will be doing. They'll be trying to do what they clearly were unable to do or failed to do slightly last week, and reposition through a presidential race, through congressional races, through local candidates to try to get back that piece of the country, which you don't have to think of it. I think one of the things that I think about with polarization, people talk about undecided voters, almost not a thing anymore. People decide, they may decide whether they're going to vote or not late, but it's a very, very small slice. But there's a larger chunk that will just kind of vote on the atmospherics and where the country is, and there is kind of a national mood that emerges through that. And you can look at that same map that I just referenced and say, okay, the nation spoke, and it spoke with a fair amount of, if not unity, unison. And that movement is significant, and it's not necessarily permanent. It's not a new order. It has enormous consequences. Elections do. But there are things that I think the lessons of this election are, like any election, they're manifold, but they're similar enough in this case that I think the issues that seem to sway voters will be scrutinized by both parties. There will be unity in that, if nothing else.
So let's move a little bit towards Jewish and Israel-related questions, which I think are the questions that people would not talk about on the news as much and probably feel very relevant to the people in this room. So what, if anything, have we learned about Jewish voting patterns from this election so far?
Sure. Yeah, there was a lot of talk about where Jewish voters would land. It turned out really not that different than most every other election that we have meaningful exit poll data on. Around a quarter of Jews voted Republican, 3/4 or so voted Democratic. There were some interesting things in states where, the places where the top of the ticket was not at issue, like a California or a New York, that you saw some differences in voting patterns, but there wasn't.
One poll said 43%.
What's that?
43% in New York.
In New York, yeah, and that's and California had roughly similar numbers. It's a hard thing to really poll on because there aren't enough Jews in most places to tell you something meaningful, but in the places that you can bring it. Some of these bluer places like New York, like California, did seem to draw a larger number of Republicans. I think some of it, might be just the Israel issue by itself, which of course has divided American Jews because of the current government and because of the way that things have played over the last 13 months now, since last October. And the Trump administration and certainly Trump's rhetoric of being very pro-Israel resonated with a certain numbers in lots of places, particularly places with much more conservative or Orthodox communities. You saw that. But I also think, similar to what I said earlier, we were talking earlier about the Latino vote, American Jews, the only thing they care about is not Israel, right? Like we're a big, diverse group in our own way, where there's lots of different issues that animate our collective lives, and people make their decisions for a whole range of things, and religion may or may not be one of them. So it didn't strike me that there was a meaningful difference that set American Jews apart from our Christian friends and neighbors. But leaving aside a couple of the big blue states where overall, there were a lot more votes for Republicans, just generally. Maybe people felt like it was more of a safe, quote unquote, safe vote than if you lived in a Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. I think that happened in the midterms as well. But that was the one kind of nugget that stuck out in me as well.
How much do you think the Israel-Hamas war impacted how people voted? Or asked another way, did Harris lose votes because of it, or did Trump win votes because of it?
There were voters that I think had previously identified as more likely to be Democratic on the progressive side, in the Muslim American communities or Arab American communities. You saw Dearborn, Michigan, the most striking example. None of that lost the election, right? That by itself. I think where the Israel-Hamas war really probably harmed Harris is in the perception of another hotspot and just something else in the news that seemed like it was chaotic, seemed like it was out of control. It was just a lot of pictures and a lot of coverage of, between that and the Ukraine war. Trump would like to say, there were no wars on my watch and I'm going to end them all quickly. I think it was an uncertain time in this country for a lot of reasons. But like I said earlier, I don't think there was a thing. I mean, the biggest thing by far to me was prices. And other things kind of flowed out of that, whether it's the border and crime or immigration and crime separate from that, or Israel or Russia, Ukraine, or you name it. I feel like everything else was kind of underneath it. But I don't think that tipped the election any more than any other of those issues I just listed.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that you don't think that having Josh Shapiro as a running mate would have caused Kamala Harris to win the election. But do you think that her decision not to choose him as her running mate had anything to do with anti-Semitism?
I mean, she's married to a Jew.
I'm not saying not necessarily that she's
right, but she was afraid of it. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I was among those that thought that Josh Shapiro was a very strong choice, and if no other reason that he's very popular in the most important battleground state in the country, it made sense. But when I saw Josh Shapiro campaigning after he was not selected, I think there were other considerations that Vice President Harris had in mind, and I think Governor Walz was a better fit for her personally, which at the end of the day has to be where it is. And I think that you make a choice with this. You can't have the both. He was out there as a very effective and very active surrogate, obviously. But I think and I don't know exactly what was inside her thinking overall. I didn't get the sense that she was running from the fact that she was married to a Jew, or that she very strongly considered putting a Jewish man on the ticket with her. I think the Tim Walz package seemed more appealing to her at the time. The way he conducted himself, the kind of coach image, being from the Midwest. There was a moment there, I can remember over the summer, where Walz was probably the most popular national politician out there. Through the convention, there seemed to be, a lot of people were saying that was very smart. And again, like if it had come down to Pennsylvania and she lost Pennsylvania by a point or two, I think all we'd be talking about is Josh Shapiro and what that could have meant. As it is, I think Josh Shapiro is an enormously talented politician who is very popular in a big battleground state that just went, really decisively to Republicans with the Senate race. Probably it's not done yet, and with the presidency, and that's going to make him a potential national figure moving forward.
So, soon after Trump won, Prime Minister Netanyahu called to congratulate. Was he the first call? Is that fake news that I just made up?
Maybe the first one we know about, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think we can expect to see as far as the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu? What might it mean for the war, for a possible ceasefire, for return of the hostages? Give us all the answers that we want to know.
Well, I think if you take him at his word, he will be very supportive of the Netanyahu government and giving the government what it needs. And I think much of the world is preparing for that and kind of putting the pieces in place that you need to. And that might be good militarily for Netanyahu. Whether it's good for Israel's security or ending the war or getting the hostages home, I think it's a different question entirely. Mm-hmm. And I also think, we'll see what the policy actually is, and what does it mean in practice. There are certainly limitations to what the president can do without congressional authorization, without congressional approval. I think what he wants to do in Ukraine is actually going to be a more difficult political climb even than anything with Israel. But it's hard to imagine the kind of public tensions that we saw between Netanyahu and Biden, and before that Netanyahu and Obama, arise with Netanyahu and Trump, but doesn't take much for Trump to change his tune on that either. So it could be a bumpier road than I would anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Under the last Trump administration, the Abraham Accords were signed, which normalized relationships, as you know, I don't need to tell you this, between Israel and a number of countries in the Middle East. But what do you think are the prospects for additional peace deals under the Trump administration?
I think the environment is so different now. It's hard to imagine, making real progress. Certainly, short of ending of the active hostilities and bringing the hostages home. But the Abraham Accords, were a surprise to a lot of people in and of themselves, and it was a different era, but it was quite a stunning achievement. I think there's always that possibility. Trump definitely fashions himself as the consummate deal maker. So I don't have a read yet of if they've got some kind of a big new plan there, but we're really far away from where we were 5-6 years ago in the Middle East. We're far away from where we were 18 months ago in the Middle East, and it's hard now to see what the ending would look like to allow real progress.
So you don't have the answer to
I
Middle
don't
East
know.
Shoot.
Max and Jack definitely do, though.
Okay. So I think what I'm going to do now, actually, is I told myself I wasn't going to pass this mic. I'm going to pass the mic, but don't make me regret it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to utilize your note card. If you think you have a question, I'm going to ask you to spend a minute jotting down what you think you'd like to ask. There is something that happens in these type of settings that I call a question. It's a question that is really a lecture. I don't want you to do that. I want you to just ask a question. And when you're asking your question, please approach with curiosity. This is not an opportunity for you to share your political beliefs with us. There are opportunities for you to do that sometimes with me in a facilitated way. That's not this. But if you have questions that are on your mind that you want to ask an expert, I'm going to do that. You can put your hand up. I will come around with a microphone, and I will trust you to be a good holder of the microphone, okay? So take a minute, think about if you have a question. Write it down. Okay. If you can handle Whoopi Goldberg, you can handle this. All right. I saw your hand first.
I'm going to go with the first two questions, really short questions. Why is woke a nasty four-letter word? And when did equity, diversity, and inclusion become an anti-democratic and destructive to our nation?
So I think I'll answer them at the same time, because I think the owning of a label like that is an important message for the political process, that it doesn't take much for something that sounds like a nice thing to be turned into a not nice thing by virtue of how it's labeled, how it's covered, and how it's pushed. And I think there's a lesson in that for anyone on the winning side or the losing side to take, not just the terms, but also the meaning behind them and put something in behind them. I think one of the issues that I've heard Democrats talk about in the last week is that when they were saying things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, no one actually knew what that meant. There were vast parts of the country that heard DEI and what is that? And it just felt weird to them. And if you turn that into something that's not good, then if all you're talking about is wokeness and DEI-ness, then then you've lost the thread entirely. So whether you're using a term or taking a point of view, just to know how it connects with people who live their lives in different ways than you is probably a lesson there.
Hi, thanks so much. I've been thinking a lot about the top 10 most popular podcasts, and I'm curious to the extent you are thinking about them. I struggle to listen to them. Some of them are like 3 hours long, and I struggle to know what's being said there, but I feel like they had a role in the results here. And I'm curious for those of us who would like to know more about what's being said in podcast world, like how we could get that information better.
It's a great question, and we've thought about it a lot because for the question was about the power of podcasts and the top 10 podcasts being, in some cases, too long to listen to. Or, look, podcasts for a while I thought of as kind of narrowcasting, where people are reaching a distinct group. But you really can't call it narrow if tens of millions of people are listening. And you're reaching a much broader group. And both candidates spent a lot of time on podcasts. Probably more time than they spent doing network news interviews. They spent trying to reach podcast listeners. And they tend to be pretty engaged, and they engage with the host quite a bit. It's obviously part of how people live their lives. If you have trouble listening to a particular podcast, that's because it's not for you, probably, right? Like that's the point. If it was, there probably is a podcast for you. It's something we've thought about a lot, just in the sense of this is where the candidates are trying to reach people. We want to reach people too. It's what we do, right? We want people to watch and listen and read and listen to our own podcasts, which don't have the same kind of numbers as the top 10, much as we like. And there'll be something else. Like people will have this vastly changing media diet. It's an interesting thought, and I did think, after this election cycle, maybe we needed to have a reporter, listening to those top 10 podcasts and saying what's on them and just making it part of our ecosystem because we've had a better time. But not necessarily the case that people were looking to us for those clues. If you were dialed into a podcaster, you probably weren't paying as much attention to what we were saying at a in our news coverage. But it's more than a phenomenon. It's here. It's not going anywhere.
I'm wondering if you think that as Americans we're just like generally doomed to be unhappy. Like you look at the right track, like you look at the right track, wrong track, like state of the economy numbers, like they're always so low. And so I'm wondering if you think every 4 years we're just going to be cycling through party of change, like things are just people are just going to be perpetually in this unhappy, throw out the bum state every 4 years, 2028 it'll be some Democrat comes in and then people are it's just going to be constant unhappiness. The numbers are always so low.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's definitely a long-standing strain in American politics, that looks back at some perceived golden age before and says things are not as good as they were then. And whether that's an exact reading of personal history, I mean, when you see a poll saying people were in worse shape than they were 4 years ago, literally 4 years ago, the pandemic, it's hard to say that that's literally the case for people. Now, not to change people's sentiments, and that's not my intention here. I don't doubt how people feel about it, but I think there's a recency bias that gets into that. Maybe people are happy being unhappy, complaining about their government, right? I feel like, as long as I've listened to grown-ups talk, they'd say oh, it's not like when Eisenhower was here, or when Nixon was running the country into the ground back then. There's kind of a bygone, a feeling about what the bygone era was that you're trying to get back. And I think Donald Trump with "Make America Great Again" was very much trying to tap into that from the beginning. And but I'd like to think that we're not kind of stuck in a doom loop of negativity where we're always going to think poorly. I mean, I think there've been a couple of what I would consider kind of phenoms of politics in time I've been covering. I mean, the Barack Obama phenomenon was a thing. The Donald Trump phenomenon is a thing. Much different political movements at the time. But there were a lot of people that were really happy when Barack Obama was elected. A lot of people really motivated to react against it. The Tea Party movement, and ultimately, I'd argue Donald Trump, was kind of a direct reaction to the Obama era. And there'll be some reaction to this as well. So I'd like to think we're going to find a little more kind of inner peace as a country, that we're not just angry at the state of affairs all the time. The other thing I'd say is, being mad about something can be productive. And there are a lot of people that feel a madness or sadness right now that, probably be best advised to channel into something productive. There were people that were mad about how things were going a few years ago and poured it into the candidacy of Donald Trump. And you can vote against something and it counts as much as voting for something else. But yeah, maybe we just like complaining. I don't know.
Israelites did. The Israelites really like to complain.
Can you explain why it seems as though when you look at the map of the United States, you see more liberals on the east and west coast and more conservatives throughout the middle of the country, which it seems like a much larger area?
It is a much larger area. I actually think the electoral map that we all look at and that I was, spending a lot of time with last Tuesday night into Wednesday morning is a really flawed way to look at the country. And there's better maps. And if you look at a map of the country by county and the colors there, I think it's a lot more reflective of the same trend you're talking about, because you will see in almost every state a bunch of blue dots and then huge seas of red. And if you were looking at that and didn't know any context of what those colors meant, you would say that we live in a 95-5 country. 95 for the red team, 5 for the blue team, or 90-10, something like that. And of course, take Texas, where I met my wife and worked professionally for the first couple of years as a reporter. Texas is a sea of red, with that little blueberry of Austin and a slightly less dark blue Dallas, Fort Worth area, and Houston and San Antonio, and almost every city in the country is either Democratic or leaning there. Look at Nebraska, which actually splits its electoral votes, despite this by congressional district. Even in this red wave, Kamala Harris won the one electoral vote from the Omaha area. So I think there's an urban-rural thing that's happening more than a coastal versus everyone else that you may miss if you just look at how the states are tipping. And it's economic, it's cultural, it's also self-segregating. I mean, Washington D.C. is a great example. I mean, this room and almost any room you go into Washington is filled with people who come from other parts of the country, and you pour into a place that ends up being like 95-5, Democratic, and it's a cultural difference living in a city. And I think the question about wokeism and DEI, the same kind of terms that seem kind of normal and regular course of business in a bluer part of the country seems different in a redder one. And that same map of the counties is something that Donald Trump himself points to at times to talk about the strength of the MAGA movement. And if you drive or have driven anywhere outside of any city in the country, including East Coast ones, including New York, including Philadelphia, you don't have to go far to see MAGA signs and Donald Trump and flags. It's everywhere. I grew up on Long Island. It was, when I was growing up, it was, there was a Republican in like a country club Republican sort of way. It kind of flipped to the Democrats. It is MAGA red now. And that's 40 minutes outside New York City, and that's the reality. So to me, it's become much more of an urban versus suburban, rural, and now elections are really settled in the suburbs, and that's those are the places that are likely determined, because they're somewhere between the red and the blue.
I'd like to get your perspective on a fundamental question. In your opinion, why was so much of the American public attracted to Trump?
I mean, at the end of the day, enough of the American public voted for him. It doesn't mean they were attracted to him. It doesn't mean they liked a particular policy. It just meant for this one moment in time, he was the best choice for them. And you can split it down. There's a good segment of the country that thinks the world of him, that puts his face on Rambo's body and flies the flag. And there's a chunk like that. But I don't think that's alone what elected Donald Trump at all. I think people go in there for complicated reasons. And I think for a lot of people, he was talking about things that seemed to matter to them, and that to me seemed to make a difference. And the way that he was able to portray the other side is a little bit out of touch, or just not really relevant. And a lot of it was just the circumstances. I think in 2016, people really seemed not to like Hillary Clinton ultimately, and that even though she won the popular vote substantially in the right battleground states, it didn't happen. In 2020, people seemed not to like Donald Trump, and I think the Biden victory was driven more by that than people particularly being attracted to Joe Biden. And this was a decisive victory again, around 50% of the country. Doesn't mean they like him. They're not voting for the person that you think is better as a human, or even necessarily the person that would be better for you personally. That you can vote for anything you want, but I think there was an element of him just speaking to the issues that seemed more relevant for people, at least again, this one moment.
Hi, thank you very much for coming tonight. What do you expect to see in a second Trump term in terms of anti-Semitism?
It's a good question about anti-Semitism. I would say first, I don't have any firm expectations either way. He has Jewish members of his family. He's got Jewish grandkids. His daughter converted, and they've raised their grandkids Jewish. He's obviously had a lot of business relationships over the years in New York. You wouldn't be able to not have a lot of business relationships with a lot of Jews in real estate and business all along. And I don't presume to know the man's heart. I think there are people that support him that are undeniably anti-Semitic, and there's a strain of anti-Semitism that has pervaded the movement that has, in part adopted him. But that doesn't mean that it is an anti-Semitic movement writ large. It means there's a lot of people who are anti-Semitic, a lot of white nationalists who have found in him a vessel. And it's a hard thing to square overall, because a lot of these things are, there's strains that we thought were kind of put into the corner and into the dustbin of history. And they've been revealed. So I struggle with it because it's quite unseemly, and I'd like to think there's no role for it in American politics or anyone's politics. But I think even more than the Trump movement, the year or so since October 7th has shown me how real it is, and how real anti-Semitism is, and I have no doubt that it will still be around on the other side of this next Trump term as well.
Hi. You mentioned the parallels between journalism and teaching. What is the responsibility of mainstream media to teach civics, or to, like in the debate, fact check, or find a single truth?
That's a great question from a teacher. I think what we do in journalism has to be thought of in a sense as teaching, because it's different than covering sports, or what separates it from that is that this matters in a different way. Right, and I think understanding, explaining to people what the world is about is important. I've thought about my job in a way that I think the media writ large is very bad if what we're doing is trying to tell people what to think. I think where we're most powerful and most effective is when we try to tell people what they need to think about. And that, to me, is a really important distinction that I've talked about it with my brother, who's a teacher, as well, because he's talked about having to, deal with an election in a divided class of 6th and 7th graders, and how important it is for him to betray his own political beliefs like that. And yeah, there's people that are really angry about a particular outcome, or really hated Kamala Harris, really hated Donald Trump, and to try to explain the points of view and to explain the way that all of it is out there. I do, your question about facts. I believe in facts, and I think they're an important part of what we do. And I think it's something that that I think we did in the debate of establishing things that were factual. And I think that's an important part of what we do in all journalism, is to say this is something that is the case, to say it affirmatively, to explain to people that something is true or not true and why. And it's not to like yell gotcha, it's not like haha, we've pants on fire, that's a lie. That to me isn't the point. Fact checking isn't the point. The point is facts. That's what that's what we do, and I think that remains an important part of what, to my mind, journalists need to be doing, in all their coverage.
Thank you. We all appreciate the truth, so that's great. If Trump, for whatever reason, does not complete the full 4 years of his term, what do you think will change in a Vance presidency?
So I was actually speaking about J.D. Vance with a fellow congregant earlier tonight, someone that had met him a few times. He's a bit hard to read, I think, overall, because he kind of made his name politically originally as someone who's very Trump skeptical, if not anti-Trump entirely. And he since has adopted, a lot of the language of Trump. He also, I think, some of his policy views seem more kind of firmly settled than even Trump's. And I think his views on tariffs, for instance, or on Ukraine, might even be more kind of dyed in the wool than Trump's, who's been very malleable and is will talk to a lot of people who will change his mind. But I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know what to expect. And if for whatever reason Donald Trump doesn't complete the term, he will be, J.D. Vance takes over as one of the youngest presidents ever, and someone that has a long future ahead of him. If Trump does complete the term, he can't run again. Vance, I think, would clearly be a front runner, and I do. It's interesting to me because I think Trump, in a sense, was naming an heir to the MAGA movement in naming a vice president, especially one that much younger than him. I think if he had chosen someone that was closer to his age, or didn't have his own ambitions, like Bush choosing Cheney, it wouldn't seem the same, but I think that's the presumption. But I also don't think that that's a movement that is going to be easily transferable to any other person. So I'm not convinced that, obviously if he takes over and becomes president, that's a little bit different, but I'm not convinced that the movement that's been behind Trump automatically becomes Vance's to control. And not just because it's possible that he has a break like Mike Pence did with him. I mean, which is always a possibility, but just that I don't think it's like a movement that you can just say, okay, here's the next up. When Reagan served 2 terms, clearly George H.W. Bush was the next one up. When Bill Clinton served, it was clearly Al Gore's turn, and it was Hillary's turn after that. I don't think that the Republican Party is going to be served that the same way. Certainly not in 2028, after what we've gone through in the last couple of election cycles.
This is sort of a follow-up to what you had asked, and not directed at you, and not ABC News.
I can take it.
But very generic. There's a lot of skepticism towards particularly the media, print media, TV media. What role does that play in this election, and what's the media's responsibility to get its credibility to a higher level?
It's a great question.
I mean, Walter Cronkite ended, and that's the way it is.
Yeah.
How do you get back to that level?
Well, we could use the same tagline, but if I say that's the way it is and you think that we're fake news, then no one will listen to that, right? So that's kind of the fundamental problem. And look, it's not something that you can just do and say, we're credible now, or believe us now. I think the question earlier about civics and civics education, I think, is an important one. I wish that every college or every high school in America had media literacy as a class, because I think even understanding just even the concept of how the media is viewed, I think I don't know how to even unpack that, because the media includes ABC and NBC and CBS and CNN, and also Fox News and OAN and Right Side Broadcasting and News Nation, and a lot of people that want what the audience that Fox has, and podcasters, right? They're media too. So the mainstream media, if you just stick to this, I know that we have to earn that trust and earn it back by doing the job every day and being, to my mind, unflinching about how we cover a story. What makes us different is that name, is that credibility, and we can lose it if we are not careful about it and hyper careful about it in every moment, especially in an age where everyone's got a camera in their pocket. Walter Cronkite didn't have to deal with this, right? It's more important for us to be vigilant about it. I'd like to see a world where people have a better understanding of what we do and why we do it. I'm always amazed when I go into a crowd of students, say, who really don't have an understanding of what it is that journalists do. I think we take a lot of that for granted and could do a better job explaining ourselves. But why did 70 million people watch that debate? Why does 7 or 8 million people watch World News Tonight with David Muir? There is a substantial credibility with that. I recognize there's a chunk of the country that doesn't feel that way, and some of them, might not become viewers of ours anytime soon. But it's something we have to just work on every day. Do it as clear-eyed as we can.
There's a few groups in the last few months who have become really anti-Israel or very tough on Israel. A few teachers' unions in California and New York. Well, the campus demonstrators from last spring and some this fall. A few congressmen on the far left in the Democratic Party. How significant a factor is all this in American life today, in American politics?
Yeah, it's a good question about the significance of it. I mean, I think that as the protests were going on in college campuses around the country, most college students were doing their homework and doing what normal college students do, and weren't protesting. But obviously, it was enough of a story, and rightfully so, and there were disruptions around the way. And I think a lot of institutions struggled with how to handle that. I think the strains among members of Congress, members of Congress represent their own constituencies. They have their own views. There's still a pretty strong bipartisan, and it is bipartisan consensus on support for Israel and the concept of Israel, and generally for preserving Israel. I haven't seen that really change in a substantial way. Part of the kind of after-action report that Democrats are going through now is try to understand what kind of impact that meant to have lost voters who were, maybe not even upset with Israel or the concept of Israel, but upset with what they saw specifically from the Netanyahu government or particular actions and humanitarian crises. We're in the middle of it now, so it's hard to say what the lasting impact is going to be because we don't know how the conflict ends and what the future in the Middle East is. But I think it's certainly a piece of it's a new piece of information for Democrats in particular to parse through as they try to figure out what their party stands for.
Okay, thank you, Amy, for granting me your question order. I wanted to pick up on a theme that other people have talked about, but be a little bit more specific. So I think one of the most important things to look at this stage in the election, we have a lot of data we're still going to get back, but in Missouri is probably one of the biggest examples of this. You have somebody like Josh Hawley who wins by 13 points. And at the same time, there's a ballot measure, for a pro-abortion ballot measure, passes by 4 points, and a pro-minimum wage, raising the minimum wage ballot measure, that passes by about 20 points. And that's like, there's a 30-point difference there between somebody that voted against raising the minimum wage and the people voting to increase the minimum wage. So I just want to kind of hear what you make of that. And that's true across the country too. Pro-abortion ballot measures outpaced Democratic candidates across the country. So I just want to hear kind of what you think, what you make of that, and what you think that says about people's information environment and the media that they consume.
It's a great question. I mean, Roe v. Wade, first of all, stood for almost 50 years. So I think the initial shock of the Dobbs decision coming right before the 2022 midterms, undeniably had an impact on those midterms. And you see it in the ballot initiatives that happened to be on the ballot at the same time. They kind of drove up Democratic turnout because Democrats were more in line with a abortion rights position. I think with time it has less sting. People get more used to a new reality. But I think more relevant for your question, I think there was actually a lot of voters. I think Democrats may have been hurt by the abortion referendums in some places because it gave people that were angry about that ruling kind of an out to vote, for abortion rights, but also against the party that didn't seem to be in touch with them. And I think if Democrats clearly, if they were looking for that to be, the kind of saving grace of elections for a long period of time, I think misread that. Keep in mind, Donald Trump spent a lot of time initially bragging about Roe v. Wade, but then kind of sanding away the edges. And I've seen a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence and interviews with voters of people saying, well, he said he'd leave it to the states anyway, or it's already happened, so it's not a big deal. And so that had an impact as well. And I think on things like minimum wage, I mean, people are voting on a lot of different things, and and what's in their economic self-interest, or in any individual's list of things that are important to them, might not rank as high. But I think I wonder if there's going to be a reexamination of this ballot initiative strategy, because I do think it allows a voter, again, the same angry environment we were talking about earlier, could mean voters are splitting tickets more, right? And thinking, okay, I'm going to vote for a Democrat here and a Republican here. I like this person, not that person. I like this issue, not that issue. So it may be that even something designed to drive up Democratic turnout like that might actually hurt Democratic candidates. And I presume the opposite to be true as well. I think if you're using a ballot initiative to just get your people out, maybe not.
Well, I hate to give him any. This does nothing. No, I have a playground voice.
We'll hear you.
I don't want to give this man any credit whatsoever. That being said, this is a man who bankrupted a casino, well known for not paying his bills and ruining people's lives in New York, well known for his personal faults in terms of women and all of that. Convicted on 34 counts of felonies. He's brilliant because, as we know, prejudice comes from fear and ignorance. And he's a master of playing on people's emotions. When people at rallies were interviewed, not one of them could say why they were voting for him. It was emotional. How much do you think his strategy of working on people's emotions with his hate speech and all of that worked to his credit to win the presidency again?
I honestly don't have a read on that. I think the rallies are their own animals on both sides. They're not necessarily indicative of where people, most real people don't go to rallies in their spare time, let's be honest, right? Like, there's a lot of things you can do with your time. So I think it draws out people that feel very passionately in one way or the other. And clearly there's an emotional connection that exists among people that are diehard supporters that'll, not just that will go to a rally, but will put up a sign or wear a hat. People get kind of invested in that way. I don't know that the Americans who decide an election have that emotional connection to a candidate in either direction. I think it's much more like there's a lot of people in the country that just vote every time, but they don't spend their lives thinking about politics. They tune in at the right moment and they make a decision. But I don't think an election is decided, or modern elections are decided based on that emotion. Certainly that's the most visible part of support for a candidate, but I don't think that is enough for a candidate in either party to win the country, or to win the kind of victory Donald Trump won last week.
So we're almost out of time for questions. I'm sorry. I promise you that it's just who I see and who's really good at making eye contact with me and not who I like. I want to give you one more chance to solve the Middle East peace situation. No, I'm kidding. Actually, I think it's been, I was going to say it's been a hard year, but it's been like a hard many years. What gives you hope? What makes you feel hopeful for our country?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. it's hope. It gives me hope that people show up on a Monday night with other things to do with their lives to listen to a discussion like this. It gives me hope that a lot of people watch our election coverage and want to learn something. This is democracy. What you got last week is what happens when you have democracy. And I'm heartened by the fact that there was near record number of Americans voted last week. And you don't have to agree with where people landed to celebrate that and to feel optimistic about that. And another thing that gives me hope is that this American democracy has been very resilient in the past. The institutions are very solid, and the answer to something that doesn't go your way is that there'll be another election. There'll be midterms in 2 years. There's going to be candidates showing up in Iowa by March of next year, I bet. We will be moving on. And it's not to belittle any of the consequences. The elections do have consequences. There will be much more conservative governance put into effect in this next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. This was easy to say most impactful election of our lifetimes. I believe it with this one. I think the stakes were out there, and it has consequences. But what you asked me earlier about the permanent realignments, I don't see them. I think we're one election cycle, one candidate away from another alignment, and that's worked for the country so far for almost 250 years.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's give Rick a round of applause. So I think I can speak for all of us and say that we've learned a lot this evening. And from where I sit, this conversation is really, it's a good start to reducing some of the really toxic polarization that we've seen in our country over the past year, over the past several years, really. And I also want to point out that some of what we're doing tonight is really having conversations about other people, about people who vote the same way as us or vote differently from us. And that's, I will say, you might disagree with me. I don't think that's where the change is going to happen. I think the change is going to happen when we sit down with people, person to person, when we share our human stories with them, when they listen to our stories. And I think that while some of us here are focused on political actions that we need to take over the next however many years until another election, I think there's also something that each of us should do, and that's to figure out who we can build relationships with, who did vote differently from us, who prays differently from us, who thinks differently from us on all kinds of issues. It's not easy work. It's hard work. And as you start to think about that, first of all, please use me as a resource. I've had many, 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 many conversations across divides, and I have a whole toolkit of different kinds of questions and different kinds of ways that you can ask those questions and share your own thoughts. And it might be asking someone who voted differently from you, how did you come to care about that issue? How did you come to know about it? Where do you have doubts? What made you feel really strong in what you already believe? Or how is it strengthened over time, right? There are questions that lead you to a very different place from a fact war. The fact wars probably aren't going to get you where you think they will. The human connections, though, will make a difference. And that's Judaism, right? We have these two Talmudic sages, Hillel and Shammai, and their disciples, and they disagree on issues that were of really great significance in their worlds. To us, we're like, okay, the tiles in the oven and whether or not it's kosher, but for them, it was really important. And they ate in each other's homes, and their families married people from each other's families. And that's who we're striving to be like. We need to follow in the footsteps of Hillel and Shammai. We have to step out of our comfort zones. We have to leave our bubbles. And it doesn't have to be tomorrow if you're raw. if you're angry, if you're not ready to talk. But at some point, we all have to leave our bubbles. So if you know me, which most of you do by now, we're going to close this with singing. Did you close by singing on Whoopi Goldberg?
We were on the air till 5:30 in the morning. If I was singing, I wouldn't even remember it at this point.
Right. Okay. But you didn't sing Oseh Shalom, probably. So we're going to sing Oseh Shalom to the tune of America the Beautiful. And then I will let you, you will get to go home. Oseh Shalom, Bimroma, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imeru, Ve'imeru, Amen. Thank you again, Rick.